I was carrying my toolbox up the narrow stairs of the Riverside Apartments when Mrs. Halbrook stepped out of her door like she'd been waiting for me. The hallway smelled like old carpet and broken dreams, the kind of place where people came to disappear from their former lives. I'd been living here for 8 months, trying to rebuild mine after everything fell apart. Mrs. Halbrook was maybe 70, with silver hair pulled back tight and eyes that seemed to see too much. She'd lived in 3B for years, according to the super, but I'd never heard her speak to anyone. She just watched from her peephole when people passed by, like she was keeping track of everyone's comings and goings. "Mr. Wells," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was clutching a faded blue robe around herself, hands shaking slightly. "Evening, Mrs. Halbrook," I said, setting down my toolbox. "Everything all right?" She looked up and down the hallway, then stepped closer. Her eyes were sharp, focused, not the confused gaze of someone dealing with memory problems. "You're going to hear screaming tonight," she said quietly. "Don't call the police." I stared at her. "Ma'am, 2 in the morning, maybe a little after. You'll hear it coming from below your apartment. Don't call anyone. Don't go looking. Just listen." Before I could ask what she meant, she'd slipped back into her apartment and locked the door. I heard the chain slide into place, then the shuffle of her feet moving away from the door. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should knock and ask if she needed help. Maybe she was having some kind of episode. But something about the way she'd looked at me, the certainty in her voice, made me hesitate. "My name is Deshawn, and this is my story. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from." I climbed the rest of the way to my apartment on the 4th floor, her words echoing in my head. The building was old, built in the 50s, with thin walls and floors that creaked when you walked across them. I could hear my downstairs neighbor's television most nights, the couple next door arguing about money. But screaming? That was something else entirely. My apartment was small but clean. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, and a living room with a window that looked out over the parking lot. I'd kept it simple since moving in. Just the basics: a bed, a couch I'd bought used, a small table where I ate my meals. After 6 years in the Army and the breakdown that followed, I didn't need much. I heated up leftover pizza and tried to focus on the maintenance request I needed to complete tomorrow. The building's boiler had been acting up, and the landlord wanted it fixed before winter hit Nashville hard. Simple work, the kind that kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering to places it shouldn't go. But I kept thinking about Mrs. Halbrook's warning, the way she'd said it, like she knew something specific was going to happen, like she'd heard screaming before. I tried to watch television, but I couldn't concentrate. Every sound in the building seemed amplified: footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, the hum of the refrigerator in the apartment next door. At midnight, I gave up and went to bed. But I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling for the night, the heat cycling on and off, the distant rumble of traffic on the interstate. And then, at 2:07 a.m., according to the clock on my nightstand, I heard it. Screaming. Not the kind of screaming you hear in movies. This was raw, desperate, the sound of someone in genuine terror. It was coming from somewhere below me, just like Mrs. Halbrook had said it would. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body alert. The screaming continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Silence settled over the building again, but it felt different now, heavier. I got out of bed and walked to my window, looking down at the parking lot. Everything appeared normal. A few cars scattered around, streetlights casting yellow pools on the asphalt. No sign of whatever had caused that sound. But Mrs. Halbrook had known. Somehow she'd known exactly when it would happen. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was happening in this building, and I was going to find out what Mrs. Halbrook knew about it. Because something told me that scream hadn't been random. And something told me it was connected to secrets that people had been keeping for a very long time. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scream echoing through the building. Raw and desperate, like someone fighting for their life. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind to investigate. The building had a basement level that housed the boiler room, storage units, and the landlord's office. I had access to most areas because of my maintenance job, but I'd never had reason to explore thoroughly. Today was different. I waited until most of the tenants had left for work, then grabbed my toolbox and headed downstairs. The basement was dimly lit by overhead fluorescents that buzzed and flickered. The air smelled like old concrete and heating oil. I started in the boiler room, checking the areas directly beneath my apartment. The walls were thick concrete, painted white years ago, but now stained with rust and age. Nothing seemed out of place. But as I moved deeper into the basement, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratches in the concrete floor. Long gouges that looked like they'd been made by someone dragging something heavy, or someone struggling against restraints. I followed the marks to a storage room that should have been locked. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, I found a space that had been cleared out recently. The dust on the floor was disturbed, and there were dark stains on the concrete that could have been oil or blood. In the corner, almost hidden behind an old water heater, I found something that stopped my heart. A metal chain, maybe 3 feet long, with restraint cuffs still attached to one end. The kind used by law enforcement, or by people who wanted to keep someone from escaping. I picked up the chain with shaking hands, and that's when I saw it. Caught on one of the links was a small piece of fabric, army green, like the uniforms we'd worn overseas. And attached to the fabric was something that made the world tilt sideways. A military dog tag. Scratched and dented, but still readable. Wells, Corey J., my brother's name. My brother, who'd disappeared 6 years ago while stationed at Fort Campbell, just an hour north of Nashville. My brother, who'd been declared AWOL and then presumed dead when they couldn't find any trace of him. I sat down hard on the concrete floor, staring at the dog tag in my palm. Corey had been wearing this the last time I saw him. He'd been excited about something, said he'd made a discovery that was going to change everything. 2 days later, he was gone. The official story was that he'd gone off base without permission and never returned. The Army had conducted an investigation, but they'd found nothing. No body, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where he might have gone. Eventually, they'd written him off as a deserter. But I'd known my brother. Corey wasn't the type to run away from anything. He was 22, dedicated to his service, planning to make the Army his career. He wouldn't have just disappeared. Now, 6 years later, I was holding proof that he'd been here, in this basement, in this building where I'd been living for 8 months, drawn by cheap rent and the need to start over. I tried to call 911, but my phone showed no signal. That was strange. I'd had full bars upstairs. I tried the landline in the landlord's office, but the line was dead. Someone had cut the phone lines. I pocketed the dog tag and the chain, locked the storage room, and headed back upstairs. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing with possibilities. Had Corey been held here? Was he still alive somewhere? Who had taken him? And why? Mrs. Halbrook was waiting for me in the hallway when I reached the 3rd floor. She stood by her door, watching me with those sharp eyes. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. "You knew," I said. "You knew my brother." She nodded slowly. "Come inside. There are things you need to understand." Her apartment was the opposite of mine, cluttered with photographs, books, and papers stacked on every surface. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, some dating back decades. "Your brother came to see me before he disappeared," she said, settling into a worn armchair. "He was investigating something. Something dangerous." "What kind of something?" She pointed to a photograph on the mantel. It showed a group of soldiers in dress uniforms, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. In the center of the group was a younger version of Mrs. Halbrook, wearing what looked like a civilian contractor's badge. "I used to work for the government," she said. "Security clearance, classified projects. I retired years ago, but I kept my eyes open. Your brother had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. I studied the photograph more closely. There was something familiar about the building in the background. And then I realized why. It was the same building where Corey had been stationed. The same place he'd disappeared from. "Mrs. Halbrook," I said quietly, "what happened to my brother?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The screaming you heard last night? It wasn't the first time, and I'm afraid it won't be the last." Mrs. Halbrook disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a shoebox filled with photographs. Her hands were steadier now, like talking about the past had given her purpose. "Your brother visited me 3 times before he vanished," she said, settling back into her chair. "He'd heard I used to work in military intelligence. He needed someone who understood how these things worked." She handed me a photograph that made my breath catch. It showed Corey with 4 other soldiers, all in combat fatigues, standing outside what looked like a temporary command post. They were smiling, arms around each other's shoulders like brothers. But that wasn't what made me stare. In the background, barely visible through a window, was Mrs. Halbrook. Younger, maybe in her 50s, wearing a civilian contractor's badge and talking to someone in an officer's uniform. "This was taken at Fort Campbell," she said, "about a month before Corey disappeared. He brought it to me because he recognized me from the base." I flipped the photo over. Written in Corey's handwriting were 5 names, including his own. 4 of the names had been crossed out with red ink. "What happened to the others?" I asked. "Dead," she said simply. "All within 6 months of this photo being taken. Car accidents, training incidents, one supposed suicide. Your brother was the last one alive." The photo felt heavy in my hands. I looked more closely at Corey, at the way he was standing slightly apart from the others, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He was wearing a watch, the same watch I wore now, the one that had been shipped to me with his personal effects after he was declared dead. But in the photo, the watch face was clearly visible, and it showed exactly 2 sous. The same time Mrs. Halbrook had warned me about. The same time I'd heard the screaming. "He knew," I said quietly. Somehow, he knew what was going to happen. Mrs. Halbrook nodded. "Your brother was smart, too smart for his own good. He figured out what they were doing to soldiers like him." "What were they doing?" She stood up and walked to her window, looking down at the parking lot. "Experiments. Testing new interrogation techniques, psychological manipulation, drug trials. All off the books, all deniable. They used soldiers who wouldn't be missed. Troublemakers, loners, people who asked too many questions. And Corey asked questions. He found records he wasn't supposed to see. Medical files, authorization documents, payment records to private contractors. He realized they were using soldiers as test subjects. I studied the photo again, looking at the faces of the dead soldiers. They all looked young, eager, proud to serve their country. None of them had any idea what was coming. "Why did he come to you?" "Because I'd worked with the people running these programs. I knew their methods, their cover stories, and I knew how they disposed of evidence when things went wrong." She turned back to face me, and I could see the weight of years in her eyes. "Your brother thought he could expose them. He thought if he gathered enough evidence, he could make it public and stop what they were doing. But they found out." "They found out," she confirmed, "and they made him disappear." I set the photo down carefully on her coffee table. "Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you go to the police when Corey first came to you?" Mrs. Halbrook laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Who do you think some of these contractors work for now? Who do you think covers up loose ends when military operations go sideways?" She had a point. If there was a conspiracy involving military personnel and private contractors, local police wouldn't be equipped to handle it. They might even be compromised. "The screaming I heard last night," I said. "Was that a message?" she said. "They know you're Corey's brother. They know you're here. and they're letting you know what happened to him." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Are they going to come for me too?" "That depends," she said, "on what you decide to do with what you've learned." I looked at the photo again, at my brother's face, at the watch showing 2, at the crossed-out names of dead soldiers. "What did Corey want you to do if something happened to him?" Mrs. Halbrook smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "He wanted me to find his brother, the one person who might be stubborn enough to finish what he started." She handed me another photograph. This one showed Corey alone, taken somewhere I didn't recognize. He was holding a manila envelope and looking directly at the camera with an expression I remembered from our childhood. It was the look he got when he'd made up his mind about something and nothing was going to change it. On the back of the photo, in Corey's handwriting, was a single line. "If you're reading this, it means I trusted the right person." I understood then that this wasn't just about finding out what happened to my brother. This was about finishing the job he'd started. This was about making sure the people who'd killed him and his friends faced justice. And it was about making sure no other soldiers disappeared into the darkness of classified programs that valued secrecy more than human life. The war was coming home, and this time, I was going to be ready for it. I spent the rest of that day researching everything I could find about the building's history. Mrs. Halbrook had given me a starting point. The name of the man who'd owned the property before it became the Riverside Apartments. Colonel James Richardson, retired military, who'd purchased the building in 2015 and converted it to low-income housing. According to public records, he'd sold it to the current management company just 2 years later, making a substantial profit on the investment. What the public records didn't show was Richardson's background. For that, I had to dig deeper. I used the library's computers, bouncing between databases and cross-referencing names from military contractor lists. What I found painted a picture that made everything click into place. Richardson hadn't just been any colonel. He'd been part of a special projects division that worked with private security companies on classified research. His unit had been disbanded in 2016 following what the official reports called budgetary restructuring. But I found mentions of the unit in congressional hearing transcripts, buried in discussions about military ethics and oversight. Senators asking pointed questions about unauthorized research programs. Pentagon officials giving non-answers about proper authorization procedures. The timeline fit perfectly. Corey had disappeared in 2017. Richardson's unit had been disbanded in 2016. The building had been converted to apartments in 2015. They'd been using the basement as a black site. Somewhere off the books where they could conduct whatever experiments they wanted without oversight or accountability. I printed everything I could find and headed back to the apartments. Mrs. Halbrook was waiting for me in the lobby, like she'd been watching for my return. "Find anything useful?" she asked. "More than I expected," I said. "We need to talk." Back in her apartment, I spread the documents across her coffee table. She studied them carefully, nodding at some, frowning at others. "Richardson," she said finally. "I remember him. Ambitious, ruthless, completely convinced that the ends justified any means necessary. Did you work with him directly?" "A few times. He was always pushing the boundaries, always looking for new ways to extract information or break down resistance. He saw soldiers as raw material for his experiments." I showed her a photograph I'd found in one of the congressional hearing documents. It showed Richardson receiving a commendation from a Pentagon official I didn't recognize. "That's General Morrison," Mrs. Halbrook said, pointing to the official. "Richardson's superior and biggest supporter. He's the one who protected Richardson's programs from oversight." "Is Morrison still active?" "Retired, but he sits on the boards of several defense contractors." "Still has influence, still protects his people." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. "So we have Richardson, who owned this building and ran illegal experiments, Morrison, who protected him from oversight, and my brother, who stumbled onto evidence of what they were doing. Your brother and 4 other soldiers who died for asking the wrong questions." I picked up the photo of Corey with his unit, looking at their young faces. "What kind of experiments were they running?" Mrs. Halbrook was quiet for a long moment. Interrogation resistance, psychological breaking points, drug-induced compliance. They wanted to understand how to break people down completely and rebuild them as assets. They were trying to create sleeper agents. Among other things, the applications were endless. Perfect soldiers who followed orders without question. Deep cover operatives who could be activated years later. Prisoners who could be turned against their own organizations. The scope of it was staggering. How many soldiers had they experimented on? How many had died or disappeared? How many families had been told their sons and daughters were deserters when they were actually victims? "Mrs. Halbrook," I said, "do you still have contacts in the intelligence community?" "A few. People who were as disgusted by these programs as I was. People who got pushed out or forced to retire when they asked too many questions. I need to know if Richardson and Morrison are still operational, if they're still running programs like this." She studied my face carefully. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to finish what my brother started," I said, "but I'm going to do it smarter than he did. No going to authorities who might be compromised. No trusting people who might betray me." "That's a dangerous game you're talking about." "They made it dangerous when they killed my brother." Mrs. Halbrook nodded slowly. "There's something else you need to know. Something your brother discovered right before he disappeared." She walked to her bookshelf and pulled out a thick folder hidden behind some old novels. Inside were photocopied documents, some with official letterheads, others that looked like internal memos. "Your brother found the financial records," she said. "Payment authorizations for the experimental programs, and the names of everyone who profited from them." I opened the folder and found myself looking at a web of corruption that went far beyond just Richardson and Morrison. Defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, private security firms, all feeding off classified military budgets to fund research that violated every ethical standard. At the bottom of one document was a signature I recognized from my research. Richardson's authorization for enhanced interrogation research, with a budget allocation of $12 million. $12 million to experiment on American soldiers. "Mrs. Halbrook," I said, "I'm going to need your help, and I'm going to need those contacts you mentioned. You understand what you're up against? These people have resources, connections, the ability to make problems disappear." "Yeah," I said, thinking about the screaming I'd heard, about my brother's dog tag in that basement storage room. "I understand exactly what I'm up against." "And you're not afraid?" I looked at the photo of Corey one more time, at that watch showing Tuiv's, at the names of dead soldiers crossed out in red ink. "I'm terrified," I said, "but I'm more angry than afraid, and that's going to have to be enough." Mrs. Halbrook made contact with her old intelligence network that night. I could hear her on the phone in the next room, speaking in the careful code words of people who'd spent careers dealing with classified information. When she emerged from her bedroom, she was carrying a metal briefcase that looked like it had seen better days. "My contact wants to meet," she said. "Tomorrow night, neutral location. She has information about Richardson's current operations." "She?" "Agent Patricia Kim, retired NSA. She was forced out for asking questions about unauthorized domestic surveillance programs. She's been tracking Richardson's activities for the past few years." The next evening, we drove to a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Nashville. The kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and pie, where nobody paid attention to quiet conversations in corner booths. Agent Kim was waiting for us, a small Asian woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair. She looked like someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. "You're Corey's brother," she said when we sat down. It wasn't a question. "Mrs. Halbrook told you about him?" "I knew about Corey before he disappeared," Kim said. "He'd reached out to me through unofficial channels, said he had evidence of military personnel being used in unauthorized experiments." She slid a manila envelope across the table. "This is everything I've been able to gather about Richardson's operation since he supposedly retired." Inside the envelope were photographs, financial records, and what looked like surveillance reports. The first document made my blood run cold. It was a list of names and locations. Soldiers who'd gone missing or died under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. 23 names in total, including Corey's. "He's still active," Kim said quietly. "Different name, different company, but the same operation. They've gotten more sophisticated about covering their tracks." I flipped through the documents, seeing a pattern emerge. The missing soldiers were all from different units, different bases, different time periods, but they all had one thing in common. They'd been asking questions about classified programs or reporting concerns about unethical activities. How is he still operating if his unit was disbanded? "Private contractors," Kim said. "No oversight, no accountability. As long as the results justify the budget, nobody asks questions about methods." Mrs. Halbrook leaned forward. "Where is he based now?" "That's the interesting part," Kim said. "He's operating out of multiple locations, but his primary facility is right here in Nashville, a private research company called Strategic Solutions International." I'd heard that name before. It was on some of the financial documents Mrs. Halbrook had shown me. "What kind of research?" "Officially, corporate security consulting and employee psychological evaluation. Unofficially?" Kim shrugged. "Same thing he was doing in the Army, just with better legal protection." She handed me another document. This one was a floor plan of a building downtown, marked with security positions and access points. "He's got about 30 employees, mix of former military and civilian contractors. They work on government contracts, but also private sector stuff, corporate espionage, industrial security, personal protection for high-value targets." "And the experiments?" "Still happening. Different test subjects now, though. Homeless veterans, people with addiction problems, anyone who won't be missed if something goes wrong." The scope of Richardson's operation was bigger than I'd imagined. He wasn't just experimenting on active military personnel anymore. He was targeting the most vulnerable members of society, people who had no one to advocate for them if they disappeared. "Agent Kim," I said, "what would it take to shut him down?" "Evidence that would hold up in federal court. Financial records showing misuse of government funds. Documentation of illegal human experimentation. Witness testimony from victims or participants." "Do we have any of that?" Kim smiled grimly. "Your brother was very thorough. Before he disappeared, he managed to copy files from Richardson's computers. Financial records, experiment protocols, video footage of some of the sessions." My heart started racing. "You have Corey's evidence?" "Some of it. He was smart enough to hide copies in multiple locations. I have one set, but there are others." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a flash drive. "This contains about half of what your brother collected. Financial records mostly, showing payments from government agencies to Richardson's various front companies." "What about the other half?" "That's where things get complicated," Kim said. "Corey hid the most damaging evidence somewhere else. Video files, audio recordings, documents that would definitively prove what Richardson was doing." "Where?" "We don't know. He said he left clues for someone he trusted to find it. Someone who would know how to interpret the signs he left behind." I thought about the photo with the watch showing 2 hours, about the screaming I'd heard at exactly that time, about the dog tag in the basement, and Mrs. Halbrook's warning. "He left the clues for me," I said. Kim nodded. "That's what we think. The question is whether you can figure out what he was trying to tell you." I studied the flash drive in my hand. It was smaller than my thumb, but it contained evidence that could bring down a conspiracy that had killed dozens of people. "Agent Kim, if I find the rest of Corey's evidence, will you help me get it to the right people?" "I'll do more than that," she said. "I'll help you make sure Richardson and everyone who protected him faces justice." As we prepared to leave the diner, Kim grabbed my arm. "Be careful," she said. "Richardson knows you're here, knows you're asking questions. He's not going to wait much longer before he tries to eliminate the threat." "Let him try," I said. "I'm not the same person my brother was. I know what I'm up against now." But as we drove back to the apartments, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That somewhere in the darkness, Richardson's people were planning their next move. The war wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. I didn't hear the screaming that night, but I heard something else. Around 2 a.m., the same time as before, footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, like someone was checking each apartment door. I got up quietly and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I could hear a faint mechanical sound coming from somewhere nearby, like machinery running in the walls. The next morning, I decided to investigate the building's ventilation system. If Richardson's people were watching the apartments, they might have installed surveillance equipment in the ductwork. I started in the basement, tracing the main ventilation shaft that ran up through the center of the building. The ductwork was old but well-maintained, with access panels every few floors for cleaning and repairs. On the third floor, near Mrs. Halbrook's apartment, I found something that didn't belong. A small camera, no bigger than a quarter, mounted inside the ventilation shaft with a clear view of the hallway. The kind of high-end surveillance equipment that wasn't available to civilians. I left it alone but made note of its position. If they were watching, I didn't want them to know I'd found their surveillance system. But as I continued my inspection, I found more cameras, one on each floor, positioned to cover the main hallways and stairwells. The building was under complete electronic surveillance. I finished my inspection and went back to my apartment, careful to act normally. But my mind was racing. How long had they been watching? Did they know about my conversations with Mrs. Halbrook and Agent Kim? Around noon, Mrs. Halbrook knocked on my door. When I opened it, she looked shaken. "They're escalating," she said quietly. "I got a phone call this morning. Someone claiming to be from the gas company, saying they needed to inspect my apartment for a leak. Did you let them in?" "Of course not. But they'll find another way. They always do." I told her about the cameras I'd found. Her face went pale. "How long do you think they've been watching us?" "Probably since the night I heard the screaming. Maybe longer." Mrs. Halbrook sat down heavily on my couch. "Your brother warned me this might happen. He said if anyone came looking for him, they'd eventually come for anyone who'd helped him. What did he tell you to do if that happened?" "He gave me instructions, emergency protocols in case the situation became dangerous." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small key. "Storage unit downtown, number 247. He rented it under a false name and paid for 2 years in advance." "What's in it?" "I don't know. He said it was insurance, evidence that would protect anyone who was trying to help him." I took the key, feeling its weight in my palm. "Mrs. Halbrook, I think you should leave the building for a while. Stay with friends or family until this is over." "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "I made a promise to your brother. I'm going to keep it." That afternoon, I drove to the storage facility. It was one of those sprawling complexes on the edge of town, rows of identical metal units protected by a chain-link fence and security cameras. Unit 247 was in the back corner, away from the main office and foot traffic. I used Corey's key and rolled up the metal door. Inside was a single wooden crate, about the size of a footlocker. It wasn't locked, but it was sealed with evidence tape that had Corey's signature across it. I broke the seal and opened the crate. Inside were 3 items: a digital video camera, a stack of manila folders, and a handwritten letter with my name on it. I read the letter first. "Deshawn, if you're reading this, it means the people I was investigating found me before I could finish the job. The camera contains video evidence of their operations. The folders contain financial records and personnel files. This should be enough to destroy them, but only if you're smart about how you use it. Trust Agent Kim, but don't trust anyone else in the government. They have people everywhere. The screaming you heard was meant to guide you here. I set up a dead man's switch. If I disappeared, certain evidence would be released automatically, but they found a way to stop it. Now it's up to you. Don't try to be a hero. Just get the evidence to the right people and let justice take its course. I love you, brother. Finish what I started. Corey." I loaded the camera and folders into my car, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and determination. Corey had known he was going to die, and he'd still tried to protect me. He'd left me everything I needed to bring down Richardson and his operation. But as I drove back toward the city, I noticed a gray sedan following me. It stayed 3 cars back, matching my speed, turning when I turned. They knew about the storage unit. They'd been waiting for me to lead them to Corey's evidence. I took a detour through downtown Nashville, using my knowledge of the city's layout to lose the tail in traffic. When I was sure I wasn't being followed anymore, I called Agent Kim. "I found it," I said. "Everything Corey collected. Video, documents, financial records." "Good," she said. "But we need to move fast. My sources tell me Richardson is planning something big, something that's going to make all our evidence irrelevant." "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet. But whatever it is, it's happening soon." As I hung up the phone, I thought about the screaming I'd heard, about the cameras hidden in the ventilation system, about the gray sedan that had followed me from the storage facility. Richardson wasn't just running an illegal operation anymore. He was preparing for war. And I was about to give him one. I needed allies, people who understood what we were up against and had the skills to help. That meant reaching out to someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Sergeant First Class Miguel Rodriguez had been my squad leader in Afghanistan. We'd served 2 tours together before I'd taken early discharge after my breakdown. Miguel had stayed in, but last I'd heard, he was working private security somewhere in the South. It took me 3 days to track him down. He was working for a company called Apex Protection Services, doing corporate security consulting. When I finally reached him by phone, his voice was cautious. "Deshaun? Man, it's been forever. How are you holding up?" "Not great, Miguel. I need to ask you about something, and it might put you in a difficult position." "What kind of something?" I told him about Corey, about Richardson, about the evidence I'd found. Miguel listened without interrupting, but I could hear the tension building in his voice. "Jesus, Deshaun, you're talking about some serious conspiracy theory stuff here." "It's not a theory. I have proof." "Proof of what, exactly?" "That military personnel were being used as test subjects in illegal experiments. That soldiers who tried to expose it were murdered." Miguel was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder. "Where are you right now?" "Nashville. Why?" "Stay put. I'm driving down tonight. We need to talk face to face." Miguel arrived at my apartment around midnight, looking older than his 32 years. Military bearing was still there, but something had changed in his eyes. He looked like a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little. "You said you have proof," he said without preamble. "Show me." I loaded Corey's video camera and queued up one of the files. The footage was grainy, shot with a hidden camera, but it was clear enough to see what was happening. A concrete room, bare except for a metal chair and some monitoring equipment. A young man in military fatigues, strapped to the chair, screaming as someone off-camera administered what looked like electric shocks. Miguel watched in silence, his face growing paler with each second. When the video ended, he sat back heavily. "How many of these files are there?" 17. Different subjects, different techniques. All soldiers, all being tortured in the name of research. "And your brother filmed this?" "My brother infiltrated Richardson's operation and documented everything. Then he disappeared." Miguel stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the parking lot. "Deshaun, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." "What?" "I know about Richardson. Not personally, but I know people who've worked for him. The company I work for now, Apex Protection. We've done subcontract work for Strategic Solutions International." My blood went cold. "You've worked for Richardson?" "Not directly. Apex provides security services for SSI's clients, executive protection, facility security, that kind of thing. But I've heard rumors about their research operations." "What kind of rumors?" Miguel turned away from the window. That they're still running Black Ops programs under civilian cover. That they're recruiting former military personnel for jobs that aren't exactly legal. Did they try to recruit you? Yeah, about 6 months ago. Offered me 3 times my current salary to join their special projects division. I turned them down. Why? Because I asked around about SSI, and everyone who'd worked for them either loved them or wouldn't talk about them at all. That's a red flag in this business. I felt a chill run down my spine. Miguel, are they going to know that you're here? That you're helping me? Probably. Apex shares information with its clients, and SSI is very interested in keeping track of former military personnel in the area. Then you're in danger too. Miguel smiled grimly. Brother, I've been in danger since the day I left Afghanistan. The difference is, now I know who I'm fighting. He sat back down and studied the video camera. What's your plan? You can't just walk into the FBI with this footage and expect them to act on it. SSI has connections throughout the government. Agent Kim thinks she can get the evidence to the right people, journalists, congressional investigators, people who can't be bought or intimidated. And you trust this Agent Kim? Mrs. Halbrook does. And she knew my brother. Miguel nodded slowly. Okay. But you're going to need more than just evidence. You're going to need protection while this all plays out. Richardson's not going to sit quietly while his operation gets exposed. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you let me help. I've got contacts in the private security world, people who owe me favors. We can put together a team to watch your back while you get this evidence to the right people. Miguel, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted. Because if what you're telling me is true, then Richardson's operation is everything we swore to fight against when we put on the uniform. It's a betrayal of everything we believed in. He picked up one of the manila folders and flipped through it. Besides, your brother wasn't the only soldier who disappeared. I've been tracking cases for the past year, trying to figure out why so many good soldiers were going AWOL or dying in suspicious accidents. You've been investigating this too? Not investigating exactly, just keeping track. But seeing this footage, reading these financial records, it all makes sense now. Miguel closed the folder and looked at me directly. Deshaun, I need you to understand something. Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Richardson's people play for keeps. They've killed to protect their secrets, and they'll kill again. I understand. Do you? Because it's not just your life at risk anymore. It's Mrs. Halbrook, Agent Kim, me, anyone who gets involved in exposing this. I thought about Corey, about the screaming I'd heard, about the crossed-out names in the photograph. They made it personal when they killed my brother. I'm going to finish what he started, with or without help. Miguel stood up and extended his hand. Then you've got help. Let's bring these bastards down. As we shook hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Corey disappeared. Hope. For the first time in 6 years, I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Richardson had resources, connections, and government protection. But now I had something he didn't expect. I had brothers willing to fight alongside me. Miguel's contacts came through faster than I'd expected. Within 24 hours, he'd assembled a small team of former military personnel who were willing to help expose Richardson's operation. There was Jennifer Park, a former Army intelligence analyst who now worked as a private investigator. Carlos Santos, an ex-Marine who specialized in electronic surveillance and counter-surveillance. And Janet Williams, a former Air Force security specialist who'd been blacklisted from government work for refusing to participate in what she called ethically questionable operations. We met at a warehouse on the outskirts of Nashville that Miguel had rented under a false name. The team listened as I explained what we'd discovered about Richardson and showed them some of Corey's evidence. This is bigger than just military experiments, Jennifer said, after reviewing the financial records. SSI has contracts with at least 6 different government agencies. They're not just experimenting on soldiers anymore. They're providing enhanced interrogation services for domestic law enforcement. What does that mean? I asked. It means they're torturing suspects in American jails and prisons, Carlos said, Local police departments are paying SSI to break suspects who won't cooperate with normal interrogation techniques. The scope of Richardson's operation was staggering. He'd created a torture-for-hire business that operated throughout the American justice system, protected by government contracts and legal immunity. "We need to get this evidence to the media," Janet said. "Full exposure, multiple outlets, make it impossible for them to cover up or discredit." "Agent Kim is working on that," I said. "But Richardson knows we have the evidence. He's going to try to stop us before we can release it." "Let him try," Miguel said. "We're ready." But I was worried about Mrs. Halbrook. She was still in her apartment, refusing to leave despite the obvious danger. If Richardson decided to eliminate witnesses, she'd be an easy target. That afternoon, I went to check on her. She was sitting in her living room, looking out the window at the parking lot with a pair of binoculars. "Watching for visitors?" I asked. "3 different cars have driven through the parking lot in the past hour," she said. "Same pattern each time. Slow circuit, checking apartment numbers, then leaving. They're conducting surveillance." I looked out the window and saw a gray sedan parked across the street. Different car from the one that had followed me to the storage facility, but the same type of vehicle government contractors favored. "Mrs. Halbrook, you need to come with me. My team has a safe location where you can stay until this is over." "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "This is my home. I'm not going to be driven out by people like Richardson. They're not going to hesitate to hurt you." "Then they'll have to live with the consequences," she said, "because I'm not backing down." I admired her courage, but I was terrified for her safety. Richardson's people had killed Corey and dozens of other soldiers. An elderly woman wouldn't even slow them down. "At least let me install some security equipment in your apartment. Cameras, alarms, communication devices." She nodded. "That would be acceptable." Carlos arrived an hour later with a bag full of surveillance equipment. He installed motion sensors, hidden cameras, and a panic button that would alert our team if Mrs. Halbrook was in danger. "If anyone tries to get in here," Carlos told her, "you hit this button and we'll be here in less than 5 minutes." As we were finishing the installation, Mrs. Halbrook's phone rang. She answered it, then held it out to me. "It's for you," she said. I took the phone, expecting to hear Agent Kim or Miguel. Instead, I heard a voice I didn't recognize. Calm, professional, with a slight southern accent. "Mr. Wells," the voice said. "My name is Colonel Richardson. I believe you have something that belongs to me." My blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. Your brother was very thorough in documenting my operations. I'm prepared to make you an offer for the return of that documentation." "What kind of offer?" $5 million, deposited in any account you specify. In exchange, you turn over all copies of the files your brother collected and agree to relocate to a location of your choosing." "And if I refuse?" Richardson's voice hardened. "Then I'll be forced to recover my property through other means that might prove unpleasant for you and your elderly friend." He was threatening Mrs. Halbrook. The bastard was threatening an innocent woman to get to me. "I need time to think about it," I said. "You have 24 hours, Richardson said. "I'll call you tomorrow night with instructions for the exchange." The line went dead. I handed the phone back to Mrs. Halbrook, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. "He's offering you money," she said. $5 million. That's a lot of money. "It's blood money," I said. "Payment for staying silent about the people he's murdered." Mrs. Halbrook smiled. "Good answer. Your brother would be proud." That evening, I met with my team to discuss Richardson's offer. Everyone agreed that it was a trap. He had no intention of letting us walk away with knowledge of his operation. "He'll pay the money," Jennifer said. "Then he'll kill us all and recover it from our accounts. Clean solution to his problem." "So what do we do?" I asked. Miguel grinned. "We set a trap of our own." The plan was simple, but risky. We'd agree to the exchange, but instead of bringing the real evidence, we'd bring copies. When Richardson's people tried to eliminate us after the payment, we'd be ready for them. The goal isn't to survive the exchange, Miguel explained. The goal is to get Richardson on record threatening witnesses and attempting to recover evidence of federal crimes. Agent Kim will have people recording everything. And if something goes wrong? Then we make sure the real evidence gets released posthumously, Carlos said. Richardson loses either way. As we finalized the plan, I thought about Corey and what he'd sacrificed to gather this evidence. He'd known Richardson would kill him, but he'd done it anyway because he believed in justice. Now it was my turn to take that risk, and unlike my brother, I wouldn't be facing Richardson alone. The war was coming to an end. One way or another, Richardson's operation was finished. Before I could meet Richardson for the exchange, I needed to know more about what Corey had discovered in his final days. Agent Kim had mentioned that Corey had tried to warn our family about what he'd found, but I'd never received any messages from him before he disappeared. That meant he'd reached out to someone else, someone he trusted to pass along information if something happened to him. I drove to my mother's house in Memphis, something I'd been avoiding for months. Helen Wells lived in the same small house where Corey and I had grown up, surrounded by photographs of her 2 sons in military uniforms. She'd never gotten over losing Corey, and my own struggles after leaving the army had only added to her pain. She was working in her garden when I arrived, hands deep in the soil, trying to coax life from the earth the way she'd tried to hold our family together after our father left. "Deshawn," she said, looking up with surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." "Hi, Mom. We need to talk about Corey." Her face changed, taking on the careful blankness she wore whenever anyone mentioned my brother. "Honey, you know how hard it is for me to talk about him." "I know, but I've learned some things about what happened to him. Things you need to know." She stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "Come inside. I'll make some coffee." In the kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of my childhood, I told her about Richardson's operation, about the evidence Corey had gathered, about the conspiracy that had killed him. She listened without interrupting, but I could see the pain building in her eyes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Mom," I said gently, "did Corey contact you before he disappeared? Did he try to warn you about anything?" She looked down at her hands, still stained with garden soil. "He called me 3 days before he went missing. Said he was working on something important, something that might put him in danger." "What else did he say?" "He told me that if anything happened to him, I should tell you to listen for the screaming. He said you'd understand what that meant when the time came." The screaming. The sound that had led me to discover Corey's dog tag in the basement, that had started this entire investigation. "Did he give you anything? Any documents or evidence?" My mother was quiet for so long that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she stood up and walked to the back bedroom, returning with a small wooden box I remembered from childhood. "He mailed this to me 2 days before he disappeared," she said. "Made me promise not to open it unless something happened to him." Inside the box were 3 items: a flash drive, a handwritten letter, and a small silver key. I read the letter first. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means I'm probably dead. I've discovered something terrible happening to soldiers like me, and the people responsible are going to try to silence me. I need you to give this flash drive to Deshawn and tell him about the screaming." The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Nashville, box number 847. Everything he needs to stop these people is in that box. Don't try to investigate this yourself. These people are dangerous, and they won't hesitate to hurt innocent people to protect their secrets. Tell Deshawn I love him, and that I'm sorry I couldn't finish this myself. Corey. "Mom, why didn't you tell me about this before?" Tears were streaming down her face. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd try to investigate and end up dead like your brother. You let me believe he was a deserter for 6 years. I let you believe he was alive," she said. "I thought if you didn't know he was dead, you might not do something foolish trying to get revenge." I felt a surge of anger, but looking at my mother's face, I realized she'd been protecting me the only way she knew how. She'd sacrificed her own grief to keep me safe. "The safety deposit box," I said. "Do you know what's in it?" "No, but Corey said it would be enough to destroy the people who killed him." I pocketed the flash drive and the key. "Mom, I need you to leave town for a while. Go stay with Aunt Sarah in Atlanta until this is over." "Are you going to the bank?" "Yes. But first I'm going to make sure you're safe." She reached out and took my hand. "Your brother was trying to save people, wasn't he? Other soldiers like him?" "Yes." "Then you do what you have to do. But you be smart about it. Don't let them kill you too." That afternoon, I drove my mother to the airport and put her on a plane to Atlanta. Then I called Agent Kim and told her about the safety deposit box. "Corey was more careful than we thought," she said. "He scattered the evidence across multiple locations to make sure Richardson couldn't recover all of it." "What do you think is in the box?" "Probably the most damaging evidence he collected. Video files, audio recordings, documents that would definitively prove Richardson's crimes." "I'm going to the bank tomorrow morning." "Not alone," Kim said. "Richardson's people will be watching the bank. If you go there, you're walking into a trap." "Then what do you suggest?" "We coordinate with local FBI agents who aren't compromised. Make the recovery an official federal operation." "And if there are no uncompromised agents?" Kim was quiet for a moment. "Then we do it ourselves, but we do it smart. Full surveillance, backup plans, multiple escape routes." As I drove back to Nashville, I thought about my mother's sacrifice, about the years she'd carried the burden of knowing Corey was dead while letting me hope he might still be alive. She'd lied to protect me. Now it was time for me to honor that protection by finishing what my brother had started. The final pieces of evidence were waiting in that safety deposit box, and tomorrow, Richardson's operation would finally be exposed. One way or another, justice was coming. I decided to postpone the bank visit until I'd explored every inch of the building where this nightmare began. If Corey had been held in the basement, there might be more evidence hidden there, evidence that Richardson's people hadn't found. Miguel and Carlos met me at the apartments at midnight. The building was quiet, most tenants asleep, surveillance cameras recording our movements. But we'd planned for that. Carlos had brought equipment to loop the camera feeds, making it appear that the hallways were empty while we conducted our search. It would only work for a few hours before the surveillance team noticed the anomaly, but that should be enough time. We started in the storage room where I'd found Corey's dog tag. Using thermal imaging equipment, Carlos scanned the walls for hollow spaces or hidden compartments. "There," he said, pointing to a section of wall that showed a different temperature signature. "Something's behind this concrete." Miguel and I used sledgehammers to break through the wall, working as quietly as possible. The concrete was newer than the rest of the basement, probably installed after Richardson had purchased the building. Behind the false wall was a space about 6 feet by 8 feet. It had been set up as a monitoring station, with banks of electronic equipment and multiple screens showing feeds from cameras throughout the building. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, showing soldiers in various states of distress. Some were clearly taken during interrogation sessions. Others showed subjects before and after experimental procedures. In the center of the wall was a larger photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed Corey, strapped to a metal chair in what looked like the same concrete room I'd seen in his video footage. But this photo was different. It showed his face clearly, and I could see the terror in his eyes. "Jesus," Miguel whispered. "They kept trophies." Carlos was examining the electronic equipment. "This is sophisticated stuff. Military-grade surveillance and recording equipment. They weren't just holding people here. They were documenting everything." I found a filing cabinet in the corner and forced it open. Inside were medical records, experiment protocols, and evaluation reports, all bearing Richardson's signature and the SSI logo. One file was thicker than the others. When I opened it, I found myself looking at a comprehensive dossier on my brother. Psychological profile, military service record, family background, and a detailed timeline of his investigation into Richardson's operation. They'd been watching Corey for months before they'd taken him. They'd known about his contacts with Mrs. Halbrook and Agent Kim. They'd known about the evidence he was gathering. But what chilled me most was the final entry in the file. Subject neutralized. Evidence recovered. Family surveillance ongoing. Family surveillance ongoing. They'd been watching me, probably since the day Corey disappeared. "Deshaun," Carlos called from across the room, "you need to see this." He was standing in front of a bank of monitors that had automatically activated when we'd entered the room. The screens showed live feeds from cameras throughout the building, including one that made me sick to my stomach. Mrs. Halbrook's apartment. They'd been watching her constantly, recording her every movement. But there were other screens showing locations I didn't recognize. What looked like cells or holding rooms, all empty, but clearly designed to hold prisoners. "Where are these other locations?" I asked. Carlos checked the equipment labels. "According to this, they're transmitting from 3 different sites around Nashville. Richardson's got multiple facilities." Miguel was studying a map on the wall that showed the locations of all the surveillance sites. "This is a network," he said. "He's not just running one operation, he's running a whole system of black sites throughout the city." I photographed everything we found, using a digital camera that would upload the images automatically to a secure server Agent Kim had set up. Even if we were caught or killed, the evidence would survive. As we prepared to leave, Carlos noticed something else. "The surveillance system is set up to transmit to an external location. Everything they record here gets sent somewhere else in real time." "Where?" He traced the cable connections to a junction box on the wall. "According to this, the main receiving station is at SSI headquarters downtown. So they have copies of everything." "Not just copies," Carlos said. "They're probably watching us right now." The thought sent a chill through me. Richardson knew we'd found his monitoring station. He knew we'd discovered the extent of his surveillance network, which meant he'd probably already moved to the next phase of his plan. As we left the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd walked into a trap. Richardson had allowed us to find this evidence. He wanted us to know how extensive his operation was. The question was why. Miguel seemed to be thinking the same thing. "This feels wrong," he said as we reached the first floor. "Too easy, like he wanted us to find this stuff." "Maybe he's trying to intimidate us," I suggested. "Show us how powerful he is." "Or maybe," Carlos said quietly, "he's drawing us into position for something bigger." As we reached the lobby, the building's lights suddenly went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. And then I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, screaming, coming from somewhere above us. Not a recording this time. This was real. Mrs. Halbrook was in trouble. We raced up the stairs toward Mrs. Halbrook's apartment, but the screaming had stopped by the time we reached the 3rd floor. The hallway was silent, lit only by the red emergency lights that cast everything in an ominous glow. Mrs. Halbrook's door was ajar. Miguel motioned for us to stay back while he checked the apartment. He returned a moment later, his face grim. "She's gone," he said. "Signs of a struggle, but no blood. They took her." I felt rage building in my chest, white-hot and consuming. Richardson had crossed a line. He'd hurt an innocent woman to get to me. "The panic button?" I asked Carlos. "Never activated. They must have moved fast, maybe used some kind of tranquilizer." As we stood in the hallway planning our next move, we heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy boots, moving quickly upward. "Back door," Miguel whispered. We moved toward the rear stairwell, but the sound of boots was coming from that direction too. They'd surrounded the building.
"Third option," Carlos said, pointing toward the fire escape at the end of the hall. We were halfway to the window when it exploded inward in a shower of glass and metal. Armed figures in tactical gear rappelled through the opening, automatic weapons trained on us. "Down on the ground," one of them shouted. "Hands behind your heads." Miguel looked at me and shook his head slightly. These weren't police officers. No badges, no identification, no Miranda rights.
These were Richardson's people. "Where's Mrs. Halbrook?" I demanded. "Shut up and get down!" As we knelt on the floor with our hands behind our heads, I heard a familiar voice from behind us. Well, Mr. Wells and his little army. I turned to see Colonel Richardson walking down the hallway. He was exactly what I'd expected. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. "Where is she?" I asked. "Safe," Richardson said. "For now. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on your cooperation. What do you want?" "I want all copies of the evidence your brother collected. Every file, every recording, every document. In exchange, I'll release Mrs. Halbrook unharmed. And then you'll kill us all." Richardson smiled. "Not necessarily. You've proven to be resourceful, Mr. Wells. I could use people with your skills. Working for you, working for the security of this country." "Your brother thought he was exposing corruption, but he was actually threatening vital national security operations. The techniques we develop save American lives. By torturing American soldiers. By developing methods to protect American soldiers from enemy interrogation. Every technique we test on volunteers helps us prepare our people for what they might face if captured." The rationalization was sickening. Richardson had convinced himself that torturing people was patriotic. "My brother wasn't a volunteer," I said. "Your brother was a traitor who stole classified information and planned to give it to foreign agents," Richardson said coldly. "He got exactly what traitors deserve." That's when I heard the sound that changed everything. A pickup truck engine, growing louder as it approached the building. The distinctive rumble of a large diesel engine being pushed to its limits. Richardson heard it too, and his confident expression wavered. The truck smashed through the building's front entrance with a sound like thunder. Glass exploded, alarms went off, and the tactical team spun around in confusion. In the chaos that followed, I caught a glimpse of the driver as he stumbled out of the wrecked truck. It was a man I didn't recognize, wearing military fatigues and bleeding from a head wound. "They know you have the files!" he shouted, before collapsing to the floor. Miguel tackled the nearest tactical officer, grabbing his weapon. Carlos rolled behind an overturned table and started returning fire. I scrambled toward the injured man, keeping low as bullets flew over my head. The man was barely conscious, but he managed to grab my shirt and pull me closer. "Storage unit," he gasped. "Your brother gave me a key. Unit 158. Everything you need to stop them." He pressed something into my hand, a small silver key and a piece of paper with an address written on it. "Who are you?" I asked. "Sergeant Mike Thompson," he whispered. "I was supposed to be dead. Car accident, 6 months ago. But I survived. Been hiding, watching them." Thompson's eyes rolled back, and he went limp, but his chest was still rising and falling. He was alive. The gunfight was intensifying, with Richardson's tactical team taking positions throughout the hallway. We were outnumbered and outgunned, but the truck crash had given us a momentary advantage. "We need to move," Miguel shouted over the gunfire. "They'll bring in reinforcements!" Carlos had found another weapon and was providing covering fire. "Fire escape! Go!" We carried Thompson between us, fighting our way to the broken window. Rappelling equipment was still hanging from the roof. We could use it to get down to ground level. As we prepared to escape, Richardson appeared at the other end of the hallway. "You can run, Wells," he called out, "but I still have your friend. And I'll keep taking people you care about until you give me what I want." The bastard was right. As long as he had Mrs. Halbrook, I couldn't just disappear. I had to find a way to rescue her. But first, I needed to get to Storage Unit 158 and find out what other evidence my brother had hidden. Thompson had risked his life to bring me that key. The least I could do was use it to finish what Corey had started. As we rappelled down the side of the building, I could hear Richardson shouting orders to his men. They'd be after us within minutes. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was ahead of them. Thompson had given me something Richardson didn't know about, another cache of evidence that could destroy his operation. The endgame was finally beginning. Storage Unit 158 was in a different facility, than the one where I'd found Corey's first cache of evidence. This one was smaller, older, the kind of place that rented month to month with no questions asked. Thompson was in the hospital, unconscious, but stable. The doctors said he'd suffered a severe concussion, but would probably recover. Miguel and Carlos were watching him in shifts, making sure Richardson's people couldn't get to him. Agent Kim met me at the storage facility at dawn. She'd brought a federal prosecutor named Lisa Chen, who specialized in government corruption cases. "Before we open this unit," Chen said, "I need you to understand the legal implications. If this evidence shows federal crimes, it triggers mandatory prosecution procedures. There's no going back once we start down this path." "Good," I said. "That's exactly what I want." I used Thompson's key to open Unit 158. Inside was a single metal footlocker, secured with a combination lock. Taped to the top was an envelope with my name on it, written in Corey's handwriting. Inside the envelope was the combination and another letter. Deshawn. If you're reading this, it means Mike Thompson found you and delivered the key. Thompson was supposed to be dead. Richardson's people tried to kill him in a staged car accident because he was asking questions about missing soldiers. But Thompson survived and has been gathering evidence on his own. This footlocker contains everything we collected together. Video testimony from other survivors, financial records showing government payments to Richardson, and the complete list of everyone who's been killed or disappeared. Use it to destroy them. Use it to make sure no one else suffers what we did. I'm proud of you, brother. Finish the fight. Corey. I opened the footlocker with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of files, USB drives, and what looked like professional video equipment. Agent Kim immediately started cataloging everything, her face growing darker with each item she examined. "This is comprehensive," she said finally. "Financial records, correspondence, medical files, video testimony. It's enough to bring down Richardson's entire network." Chen was reviewing a thick folder labeled Victims. "There are over 40 names in here," she said. "Soldiers, veterans, civilians, all people who were used in Richardson's experiments." "How many survived?" I asked. "According to this, maybe a dozen. The rest died during the procedures or were killed to prevent them from talking." I found the video equipment and set it up while Agent Kim loaded one of the USB drives. The screen filled with the image of a man I recognized from the photographs in Richardson's monitoring station. "My name is Sergeant Michael Thompson," the man on screen said. "I'm recording this testimony on March 15th, 2018. I was abducted from Fort Campbell and held at a facility in Nashville for 6 months while private contractors conducted illegal experiments on me and other soldiers." Thompson went on to describe the torture he'd endured, the other soldiers he'd seen killed, and the government officials who'd authorized the program. His testimony was calm, detailed, and absolutely damning. "There are 12 more videos like this," Kim said. "All from survivors who managed to escape or were released when they were presumed dead." Chen was studying financial documents that showed payments from various government agencies to SSI. "This proves federal funding for illegal human experimentation. It's enough to bring criminal charges against everyone involved." "What about Mrs. Holbrook?" I asked. "How do we get her back?" Kim smiled grimly. "We don't have to get her back. We're going to make Richardson come to us." She pulled out her phone and made a call. "This is Agent Kim, authorization code Bravo 77. I need a federal task force assembled immediately. Target is Strategic Solutions International. Subject is Colonel James Richardson. We have evidence of multiple federal crimes including human trafficking, torture, and conspiracy to commit murder." As Kim coordinated with federal law enforcement, Chen prepared legal documents for Richardson's arrest. Within hours, federal agents would be raiding SSI facilities throughout Nashville. "What about the media?" I asked. "Already handled," Kim said. "I've sent copies of the evidence to 3 different news organizations. The story will break tonight on the evening news." That afternoon, we watched from a federal command post as FBI agents raided SSI headquarters. Richardson was arrested as he tried to leave the building. Mrs. Holbrook found safe in a holding room in the basement. But the real satisfaction came that evening when the story broke on national television. Good evening. Tonight, we have exclusive evidence of a government conspiracy that has resulted in the torture and murder of dozens of American soldiers. Our investigation has uncovered a private military contractor that has been using federal funds to conduct illegal human experiments. The reporter was Sharon Mitchell, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing government corruption. She'd been given full access to Corey's evidence, and she didn't hold back. Among the victims was Sergeant Corey Wells, who disappeared in 2017 while investigating these illegal operations. Tonight we're showing video testimony from survivors of this program, financial records proving government funding, and evidence that government officials at the highest levels knew about and authorized these activities. The story ran for 45 minutes, with detailed documentation of Richardson's crimes and the government conspiracy that had protected him. By the time it ended, social media was exploding with outrage and demands for justice. Richardson's operation was finished, but more than that, the system that had protected him was exposed and discredited. Mrs. Halbrook was safe. Thompson was recovering. And the people responsible for Corey's death were finally going to face justice. As I watched the news coverage from my hospital room, I'd been treated for injuries sustained during the firefight. I felt something I hadn't experienced in 6 years. Peace. My brother's voice was finally being heard. His sacrifice had meaning, and the screaming that had haunted this building for so long was finally going to stop. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served. The federal courthouse in Nashville was surrounded by media and protesters on the day of Richardson's sentencing. 6 months had passed since his arrest. 6 months of trials and testimony that had exposed the full scope of his operation. Thompson had recovered completely and had testified for 3 days about the experiments he'd endured. Mrs. Halbrook had told the court about the soldiers who'd come to her for help, including my brother. Agent Kim had walked the jury through the financial evidence that proved government funding for the torture program. But the most powerful testimony had come from the survivors, 12 men and women who'd been presumed dead, but had actually escaped Richardson's facilities. Their stories were horrific, but they were alive to tell them. Richardson himself had remained defiant throughout the trial, claiming he was a patriot who'd been trying to protect American soldiers. His lawyers had argued that everything he'd done was authorized by classified government programs. The jury hadn't bought it. They'd found him guilty on 47 counts of kidnapping, torture, conspiracy, and murder. I sat in the courtroom gallery as Judge Martinez read the sentence. Colonel James Richardson, this court finds that your actions represent a fundamental betrayal of the oath you took to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. You used your position of trust to prey upon the very soldiers you were sworn to protect. You tortured American citizens in the name of national security while actually serving only your own ambition and greed. Richardson stood ramrod straight, showing no emotion as the judge continued. For the crimes of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, you are hereby stripped of all military rank and privileges. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the families of Richardson's victims. I felt tears streaming down my face as I thought about Corey and all the other soldiers who hadn't lived to see this moment. But Richardson wasn't finished. As the bailiffs moved to escort him from the courtroom, he turned toward the gallery and looked directly at me. "This isn't over, Wells," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "There are others, programs you'll never find, people with more power than I ever had. Your brother died for nothing." Judge Martinez slammed his gavel. "Remove the defendant from my courtroom." As Richardson was led away in shackles, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The man who'd killed my brother was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. But his final words suggested that the conspiracy went deeper than we'd uncovered. After the sentencing, I met with Agent Kim and Prosecutor Chen outside the courthouse. "Is he right?" I asked. "Are there other programs like this still operating?" Kim nodded grimly. Richardson's operation was just one piece of a larger network. We've identified at least 3 other private contractors who were running similar programs. What happens now? Now we keep investigating, Chen said. Richardson's conviction has opened doors that were previously closed. Witnesses are coming forward, documents are being declassified, congressional hearings are being scheduled. And the government officials who authorized this? General Morrison and 2 Pentagon officials have already been indicted, Kim said. There will be more arrests in the coming months. As the media scrum continued around us, I noticed Thompson approaching from across the street. He was walking with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of his time in Richardson's facilities. But he was smiling. "How does it feel?" he asked when he reached us. "Like justice," I said. "Finally." "Your brother would be proud," Thompson said. "He started something that's going to save a lot of lives." That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Corey was buried. His grave was simple, just a military headstone with his name and dates of service. I'd visited dozens of times over the years, but this was the first time I hadn't felt overwhelmed by grief and anger. "It's done," I said to the headstone. "Richardson's going to die in prison. The people who protected him are being prosecuted. And the programs that killed you are being shut down." I placed a folded American flag on the grave, one that had been flown over the Capitol in Corey's honor after his story became public. "You saved a lot of people, brother. Not just the soldiers who would have been victims of future experiments, but everyone who's going to be protected by the new oversight laws that are being passed because of what you exposed." As I prepared to leave, I noticed another visitor approaching. It was Mrs. Halbrook, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I wanted to pay my respects." "He would have liked that," I said. We stood together in silence for a moment, 2 people whose lives had been forever changed by my brother's courage. "What will you do now?" Mrs. Halbrook asked. "I'm not sure yet. Agent Kim has offered me a consulting position with the federal task force that's investigating the other programs. Help them understand military culture, identify potential victims." That sounds like something Corey would approve of. "What about you?" Mrs. Halbrook smiled. "I'm thinking about writing a book. The true story of what happened to your brother and the other soldiers. People need to know the whole truth." As we walked back to our cars, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my deployment to Afghanistan. Hope for the future. Richardson's conviction had been just the beginning. The investigation he'd triggered was going to expose decades of illegal government programs and hopefully prevent future abuses. My brother's death had meaning. His sacrifice had protected other soldiers and their families from experiencing what we'd been through. The screaming had finally stopped. Justice had been served. And for the first time in 6 years, I could imagine a future where the past didn't define everything that came next. 2 years later, I was running a non-profit organization called the Corey Wells Foundation, dedicated to helping veterans who'd been victims of government experiments. We'd helped dozens of survivors get medical care, legal representation, and financial compensation for what they'd endured. The foundation operated out of a converted warehouse in downtown Nashville, the same building where I'd first met with Miguel's team to plan our investigation of Richardson. It seemed fitting to use the space where we'd plotted justice to help the people who'd suffered the most. Thompson worked with me as the Foundation's Director of Survivor Services. His experience as both a victim and an investigator made him uniquely qualified to help other survivors navigate the complex process of seeking justice and healing. Mrs. Halbrook had indeed written her book. The Screaming Room became a bestseller and was being adapted into a documentary film. She donated all the proceeds to the foundation and spent her time traveling the country, speaking to veterans groups about the importance of speaking up when they witnessed wrongdoing. Agent Kim had been promoted to head the federal task force investigating illegal government programs. Her team had uncovered 17 different black ops projects operating without proper oversight, resulting in over 200 arrests and the passage of new laws protecting military personnel from abuse. On this particular morning, I was reviewing applications for the Foundation's new scholarship program when Thompson knocked on my office door. "There's someone here to see you," he said. "Says he has information about another program." The visitor was a young soldier, maybe 25, with the haunted look I'd learned to recognize in survivors of military trauma. He introduced himself as Corporal James Martinez. "I heard about your foundation from another soldier," Martinez said. "Someone who said you help people who've been used in government experiments." "That's right," I said. "What happened to you?" Martinez told a story that was horrifyingly familiar. He'd been selected for what his commanders called special training, which turned out to be psychological conditioning experiments designed to create soldiers who couldn't refuse orders. When he'd tried to report the abuse, he'd been threatened with court-martial for revealing classified information. "How many others were in the program with you?" Thompson asked. "About 30 soldiers from different units. Most of them are too scared to come forward, but a few might be willing to testify if they knew they'd be protected." I exchanged glances with Thompson. This was exactly the kind of case our foundation had been created to handle. "Corporal Martinez," I said, "we're going to help you. We'll connect you with lawyers who specialize in these cases, get you medical care for any ongoing effects of the experiments, and if you're willing to testify, we'll make sure you're protected throughout the legal process." Relief flooded Martinez's face. I was starting to think no one would believe me. "We believe you," Thompson said. "And more importantly, we know how to prove what happened to you." After Martinez left with contact information for our legal team, I walked to the window overlooking the Nashville skyline. The city looked peaceful from this height, but I knew that somewhere out there, other soldiers were suffering in silence, afraid to speak up about the abuse they'd endured. "You thinking about Corey?" Thompson asked, joining me at the window. "Always," I said, "but also thinking about how many people we've been able to help because of what he sacrificed." The Foundation had assisted over 300 survivors in its 2 years of operation. We'd helped secure criminal convictions against 15 government officials and private contractors. We'd lobbied successfully for new laws protecting military whistleblowers, but more than that, we'd created a network of survivors who supported each other, who understood that they weren't alone in what they'd experienced. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Thompson said. "What if Corey could see what we've built here? What if he could see how his courage inspired all of this?" I thought about that too, about my brother's final message, telling me to listen for the screaming. He'd known that the sound of suffering would eventually guide me to the truth and to the work I was meant to do. The screaming had stopped in the basement of the Riverside apartments. Richardson and his associates were in prison. The illegal programs had been shut down. But there were still voices calling out for help, still soldiers who needed someone to listen to their stories and believe their testimony. That evening, I drove to Corey's grave for my monthly visit. The headstone was now surrounded by flowers and small American flags left by other families who'd been touched by his story. "We helped another 30 survivors this month," I told him. "Martinez and his unit, plus some victims from a program in Colorado that Agent Kim's team uncovered. They're all going to be okay now." I sat down on the grass beside the grave, something I'd started doing when these visits became less about grief and more about sharing the work I was doing in his memory. "Mrs. Halbrook is being honored at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention next month. They're giving her an award for her service to military families. She says she's going to donate the prize money to the foundation." A gentle breeze stirred the flags around the grave, and for a moment I could almost hear my brother's voice, telling me he was proud of what we'd accomplished. "I miss you every day," I said, "but I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. Grateful that you were brave enough to stand up to evil, even when you knew it might cost you everything. Grateful that you trusted me to finish what you started." As I prepared to leave, I placed a new photograph beside the headstone. It showed the entrance to our foundation's building, with a bronze plaque that read, "Dedicated to Sergeant Corey J. Wells and all the soldiers who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice." Walking back to my car, I thought about the work that still needed to be done. There would always be people who tried to abuse their power, who saw soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of protection and respect. But there would also always be people like Corey, like Thompson, like Mrs. Halbrook, like Agent Kim. People willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. The foundation was my way of making sure their voices were heard, their sacrifices honored, and their courage passed on to the next generation of soldiers who might face similar challenges. I drove home through the quiet streets of Nashville, past the riverside apartments where this journey had begun, past the storage facilities where Corey had hidden his evidence, past the courthouse where justice had finally been served. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of a train whistle, carrying people toward new destinations and new possibilities. It was a sound full of hope, full of promise for the future. The screaming had ended. The silence had been broken. And justice had found its voice at last. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Deshawn's place? Leave your comment, like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.